Russia has barely increased the amount of territory it's taken compared to where it was at the start of the full-scale war. They've proved themselves extraordinarily inept and incompetent at combined arms and sophisticated warfare. They have resorted back to incredibly brutish techniques like the meat wave attacks.
The Russians are mobilizing people from communities which are not exactly the most fans of the Putin regime anyway. Prisoners, minorities like Dagestanis and Chechens. These are not members who are fighting for a cause that they're passionate about versus the Ukrainians.
If Ukrainians had the right munitions in the right place at the right time, what they've shown is they can exact huge losses on the Russian side of ratios of anything from 3 to 10 to 1.
This is The Global Gambit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Global Gambit. Piotr here, and we are having another conversation with the creators behind the content. So we've had many a fantastic YouTuber, but people who are passionate about the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. And someone who is joining me to talk about that with their own channel, The Silicon Curtain, which is a fantastic podcast. And frankly, it doesn't need me to sell it to you. I'm sure some of you will be coming from there to watch this one, and you already know how great it is. But the man behind that is Jonathan Fink, who does do a lot of work in the areas of propaganda narratives and disinformation, but also focuses on hybrid warfare, weaponized conspiracies, and digital resilience and media literacy. So a lot of very important words, I think, given the state of, well, X at sometimes, but other parts of the internet, particularly in the realm of the Russia-Ukraine war. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining the show.
Well, thank you for that kind and generous welcome. And you've gone through the potpourri of topics that I cover. We've also got literature, history. We've got the whole lot in there.
All right. Well, there'll be a description. In the description, there'll be a link to your channel as well as your Twitter. And so people, if you aren't familiar with Jonathan, do go and check him out. But that being said, Jonathan, we're here to talk a little bit about Ukraine in the immediacy. And then later on in the conversation, we're going to go into some of these disinformations off air. We were just discussing some of the favorite tactics that they like to use and the labeling and misdirection and things. So we might come to that. But yesterday, we had the Senate pass by 79 to 18, if I believe, votes, the Ukraine package, $61 billion or so, after it passed the House of Representatives on Saturday, which was the big one because that was the tougher one to get through. How are you seeing the bill, and what do you think it's going to mean for Ukraine in the short to medium term?
Well, I think the first thing to say, it's not contentious to say that this bill is essential for Ukraine's survival. I think ammunition, whereas it hadn't run out fully, it had certainly, Ukraine was holding on to stuff as a last resort, which meant that frontline positions did not ultimately have what they needed. And quite a few positions, some really quite defensible positions, have been overrun by the Russians or given up because simply the ammo wasn't there to defend them. So on the one hand, the delays and actually the cost in lives and the cost in territory is almost inexcusable. We'll also have seen the strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And as usual, there's been some fairly bad takes in the media. Like I saw one, and this is a mainstream commentator. This isn't a Russian bot or an asset, essentially saying, the Russians have taken the gloves off. All right, now they're hitting Ukrainian infrastructure. What does he mean now? They've been trying to do it all along. They've been trying to take these facilities out, day in, day out, week in, week out, for 2 years. The thing that prevented it was not the intent to cause harm on the Russian side. That's always been there. It was the fact that there weren't enough Patriot missiles to deflect those attacks. So the aid package is significant. 60 billion. Obviously, there's quite a lot of stuff in there. It's not going all directly to Ukraine. If you compare that to the US aid so far, in 2 years of war, it's only 44 billion. So actually, this 60 is pretty significant in terms of volume. And of course, it has spurred the UK into action to provide much smaller, but albeit very significant package of aid.
So, as always on this channel, what we like to do is I like to bring the alternative perspectives, not necessarily because it's an endorsement, because I think we shouldn't shy away by pretending they don't exist, because by acknowledging them, we can, break them down and exactly do what Jonathan does, which is, propagandize against the propagandism, if that makes sense. I'm trying to be too clever with my words here, but essentially what people on other sides will say, and there was quite a strong resistance by largely the Freedom Caucus, if I'm going to assume correctly, although I think Bernie Sanders also voted against it from a more anti-war platform, which is this package not coming too late? It is simply sustaining the inevitable, loss of Ukraine, and that the Russians, after the strikes we saw on Kharkiv yesterday, it's just a matter of time. What do you say to those arguments and those people who frame it like that, and what does this bill bring that can really turn things around for the Ukrainians?
If we go back to the start of full-scale war, Russia fully expected to take the entirety of Ukraine and to decapitate the regime in around 10 to 20 days. I know the phrase 3 days has been bandied around, but I think even they didn't sort of believe it would happen that quickly. But 10 to 20 days, they expected to really decapitate the regime, take over Kiev, and really have mopped up a significant amount of the civil society administration and anybody likely to resist. It is becoming clear they had a plan in place. They had lists of people who they, as a priority, would coerce to cooperate with the regime using threat, torture, etc. And they also had a list of people who they would simply take out, either deport to Russia or execute on the spot. We suspect that a large number of body bags were accompanying the invading troops, not for their own troops, but to essentially allow them to take away the Ukrainians that they anticipated slaughtering. We're now in the third year. Russia has barely increased the amount of territory it's taken compared to where it was at the start of the full-scale war. They've proved themselves extraordinarily inept and incompetent at combined arms and sophisticated warfare. They have resorted back to incredibly brutish techniques like the meat wave attacks, and it's taken many months for each of their so-called victories in Bakhmut, Solidar, and other places. And they're now trying to do the same tactic in Chasiv Yar. If Ukrainians had the right munitions in the right place at the right time, what they've shown is they can exact huge losses on the Russian side of ratios of anything from 3 to 10 to 1 at the various figures you see. Now, at the ratio of sort of 3 to 1, that's problematic because, of course, Russia has a much larger population and has absolutely no care about expending those people on the battlefield, wasting those human resources. But as you get into the ratios of 6 or even 10 to 1 losses on the Russian side, and there is plenty of evidence that these, where Ukraine is adequately equipped and trained, that these are possible, and where Ukraine is in the defensive position, with a positions they've fallen back to, which are properly fortified, then those ratios are not impossible. Everyone says, well, okay, but Russia has infinite resources, infinite people. It absolutely does not. Those kind of ratios are a problem for Russia, and at some point may well necessitate Putin calling another mobilization. We saw what happened in the first mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the country, and many of those have not returned. So that narrative that Ukrainian defeat is inevitable is very much, I would say, a propaganda narrative, and it is not confirmed by any of the facts on the ground or any of the facts we've seen over the last two or more years. Ukraine has been placed in a difficult situation. They've lost a lot of people, but they haven't gone for full mobilization. And the new tranches of weaponry will be hitting their stocks over the coming days, weeks, and months. It will make a huge difference, despite what many will argue. And there are some in the foreign policy community who've argued that Western weapons wouldn't make any difference on the battlefield. All the evidence suggests that's absolutely ludicrous. I mean, the impact of HIMARS when they're deployed, potentially the impact of ATACMS, and of course the domestically generated technologies that Ukraine's been working on, the long-distance drones. have had an extraordinary impact. Storm Shadow as well has been very extremely sort of dramatic. You only have to hear the wails of anguish from Russian propagandists every time there's a major sort of HIMARS strike. And you can see by the sort of column inches and the pitch in their voice, which kind of goes up several octaves when they discuss it, you know it's having an impact, and you know they are actually scared of this stuff.
Well, you've managed to sit through a segment of Russian state TV. I think that's the interview. You know, we've gone through everything there, guys. I have no more questions. No, that's just a very impressive sentiment.
Unfortunately, I listen to quite a bit of, Russian state TV on a daily basis, and it's fairly toxic stuff.
Yes, it sort of gives me sense of GP news in some ways sometimes. But yes, you've touched upon a lot of things there, which I do want to drill down to in just a second. But I think it's worth noting, actually, that, the BBC did a very in-depth analysis with a couple of other think tanks, I think, about the actual losses within the Ukrainian side. And they said they put it around 50 to 60,000. Now, this is within line of sort of the UK Defense Ministry, the US State Department or Pentagon and similar. But, the difference is sort of the Russians really, or the to use, I think, a NATO term, vatniks, is very, they really like to up the relevancy of the ratio of populations. But it's not that simple. The Russians are mobilizing people from communities which are not exactly the most fans of the Putin regime anyway, prisoners, minorities like Dagestanis and Chechens, and so on. These are not, members who are fighting for a cause that they're passionate about versus the Ukrainians, which is people sort of say that because the Ukrainians have women in the military or open to women in the military, that's a weakness. You're looking at it too sort of unidimensionally in the sense of based on purely biological. It's not only about that. So it's this sort of very narrow, deliberate rhetoric from the Russian side, which I think plays into it. But I welcome any comments on that, but also this 61 package aid includes three things, which I would appreciate you breaking down for those of us who are not as, technically savvy, which is air defense systems, mid to long range missiles and artillery shells. So Zelensky, for example, has said that the Russians have launched about 1,200 missiles in the past 2 weeks or something like that, 1,500 drones and thousands of guided bombs. And you mentioned the Patriot system. So could you outline a little bit about these different systems and what role do you think that they could play in a potential, spring offensive that the Ukrainians might undertake, as we saw them try to do last year?
I haven't seen too much about an offensive as such, and I think that we can come on to that because Ukrainian victory, I think at this point, perhaps does not rest on a traditional offensive on the battlefield. And in fact, after the failure of last year's, I think they will be wary. And of course, the failure behind that is there for a number of reasons, a whole number of reasons, including, I think, mistakes in Western planning and, of course, deficiency in supply of the equipment that was required to actually achieve it. But essentially, Russia was given a long time to dig in. So you have those fortifications there. They are deep. They're far more, I don't want to use the word competent, but they're far more extensive and effective than I think anyone on the Western military planning side was thinking. So you're still faced with that problem. How do you get beyond those fortifications? How do you then break through? I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that, which means that we have to explore the idea of victory in other ways, potentially. And Ukraine's been very adept at doing that. They've used their long-range drones to strike Russian oil refining facilities. And now they're going after Russian oil storage facilities. This is extremely effective, and it's very disquieting for the Putin regime. This is probably the first thing in 2 years that has actually given him real cause for concern. Prior to that, it was things like the Prigozhin mutiny that were probably more of a concern to him, the internal destabilization. He must now feel he's got a lid on that with I won't call it an election, but the coronation process that they've recently gone through in Russia. Putin must be feeling relatively secure internally, albeit with all the usual paranoia that comes with being a czar in the Kremlin. Ukraine's strategy to take out the Russian energy infrastructure, that is going to be causing extreme concern for them. I'm not going to use the word retaliation here because, as I say, Russia has been trying to take out Ukraine's energy infrastructure from the past. It is not retaliation for the Ukraine strategy. The Ukraine strategy is a survival strategy to try and put pressure on Russians and blunt its war machine. So if we look at the aid packages, I think Patriots is going to be incredibly important. We've seen Kharkiv and the viability of that city being threatened, with 80% of the energy infrastructure taken out in recent strikes. So the first priority must be to use Patriots to defend the large urban centers and to defend the infrastructure against further erosion. Odessa, Lviv, Kiev, those must now be huge priorities to make sure nothing further is lost. Also, preventing the depopulation of those areas is important because you need the economy to keep going in order to not just claim that territory, but to actually power your war economy. And that's an area which, of course, is an extreme risk and has been under extreme risk from the lack of US funding. So first of all, the aid package keeps Ukraine going, and any further erosion of its crucial infrastructure, maintain war effort, manufacturing, and the economy, and prevent, migration flight from the country. I think the second thing actually is psychological. The mobilization, which has been taking months to go through the Ukrainian parliament, they've just got the bill kind of sorted, but that is meeting with some lackluster response on the street. And that's understandable because you're not going to want to be drafted into an army if you think that that army is potentially not going to be victorious, or you're going to be at the front without the tools and equipment to do the job properly. It's not just even a question of being, afraid or not being patriotic. You want to know that you've got a chance of surviving and doing a good job in pushing the Russians back. So I think this aid package provides that. It reassures people that they can move to a round of mobilization and have the tools to do the job and have a fighting chance against the Russians. I think the British aid package is going to contain a lot of that small arms stuff. Again, you have to have that in place, one, to defend yourself when you've got Russians attacking your trench in wave after wave after wave of attack, which is one of their tactics. Also, the frustrating thing I think I've heard from many Ukrainians is they have decent communications in the air. They have reconnaissance drones, and they have satellite data, I'm sure, from the US. They know where the Russians are. They know when there are troop and armor buildups. And they've been able to take some of that stuff out. But over the last couple of months, more and more, they've been unable to actually hit that stuff. If they had the right munitions, they could have taken that all out. And the Russians don't have it. So they're moving around the battlefield with greater impunity. That now will, I think, revert us back to where we were sometime around sort of the middle of last year, where Ukraine certainly had a comparable ratio in artillery ammunition and probably had an advantage in terms of the precision with which it could deploy it, because it had better, comms and, visuals on the battlefield. So the artillery ratio is probably not that important. It's the precision of how you can deploy it and the precision of the equipment in being able to, follow that intelligence you've got about where the Russians are. We're also seeing, and this unites the two topics here, there's also Bradleys, there's armoured vehicles in the British deployment that they're giving there. And I think this is absolutely crucial as well, because Ukrainians have shown that they're incredibly adept at using vehicles like the Bradley. I've heard from US military experts that Ukrainians have done stuff with Bradleys that were never even considered possible by the makers or the strategists who invented those vehicles. So they are incredibly inventive in the way they use equipment and incredibly effective. So giving the tools for the job is bound to have interesting results. On the Russian side, we're seeing the Russians really coming to the end of the vast stocks of Soviet munitions and armor that they'd built up over decades. There are reports that in the last couple of weeks, they've had some of their elite divisions going into battle in Tifa. These are machines manufactured right at the start of the Cold War. Okay, if there's nothing to fire back, they're it's okay. If there's nothing
quality craftsmanship.
But if you have modern Western weapons and you have them in decent, volumes, a T-55 does not stand a chance.
So I do want to jump in on one specific follow-up on this, which is the obviously F-16's element. 1955 tank, I don't think is going to be able to outrun an F-16. I don't know, audience, what do you think? Could the Russians somehow pull a bunny out the hat? Drop a comment below. What do you think? But no, I mean, the idea being that the F-16s are soon likely to come online. There's ongoing what you call conversion training, currently ongoing in Romania, and they are multi-role aircraft, which provide stronger air-to-air and air-to-ground capabilities. And there is the expectation that a couple dozen from the Danish, the Dutch, and the US, I think, will be giving them.
The Danish indeed have announced that those are the more advanced
What do you think that could be?
So you've got refitted F-16s that actually not of the old generation, because I think you could make the case that actually older generations, and some of them will be old generations that are being provided, may not have huge advantage against the Russian Air Force. There may be a disadvantage or even some parity there. And indeed, when you have electronic warfare, which the Russians are actually rather good at, those F-16s, may be limiting their capabilities because the older models will not be, retrofitted with those advanced capabilities to counter information, electronic warfare. Going back to the Patriots, though, we tend to think of Patriots as being a defensive system, but then Ukrainians have been incredibly inventive. And even though they were running out of Patriots, they made a strategic choice a few months ago, which was to redeploy, I think, some of those batteries and use them to take down Russian aircraft. So you may recall there was a week or a 2-week period where I think about sort of 13 or 14 modern Russian aircraft were taken out, including one of the AWACS communication type aircraft. And the rumor is that they used sort of Patriots to do that. So that's quite a clever strategy, but also a very difficult one, because you're essentially saying, right, we've got finite amounts of these. We may not get any more, maybe some time before we get any more. We can't just use them to shoot stuff out of the sky around the cities, but that would then open up the battlefield to Russian air attacks, airstrikes. So I think they made a very difficult decision, almost certainly to sacrifice civilian lives in order to go and win a distinct advantage in the air war and to protect their frontline troops. So we forced Ukraine to make some very difficult but rather inventive decisions.
Yes, absolutely. Thorough military breakdown from you, which I appreciate. Being more of the geopolitical strategical level focus for me, it's good to refamiliarize myself with the intricate elements of this. But one of the things that I do want to turn to in the latter part of our conversation is what you do. And very simply, first off, this bill has been passed. It's a, field day for, large segments of X in some ways, shall we say, in that, they are putting the US government is putting domestic concerns below foreign issues. Certain people argue that, you should take care of your own issues before getting stuck in others. The whole whataboutisms of US involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, all these sorts of narrative points. What do you think those who are sort of pro-Putin are going to say about this bill, and how do you think that they're going to spin it in the coming weeks?
But this is interesting
months?
Because I think you've had a shift. You've had a shift to those who previously were repeating Russian narratives, and this includes the Speaker of the House. It even includes Trump. I'm not quite sure what's gone on behind the scenes, to be honest, and I think maybe history will show this. But you've had an extraordinary change of point of view by Speaker Mike Johnson and Trump as well. Trump today praised Johnson for getting the bill passed. You've got Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who've always been pro-Ukraine, but have been quite happy to play, I would say, domestic politics with this issue. And they suddenly seem to have got very hawkish about Ukraine and Russia's, I would say, malign influence. That means that those in the party who are distinctly pro-Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, etc., Matt Gaetz and others, they start to seem like a radical minority rather than the majority that it seemed over the last sort of 6 months or so. And it really puts in stark contrast. It's likely that those who remain are either extremely deluded or down a real kind of rabbit hole, or they are actually Russian assets. Now, I don't want to get sued by any of them, but we need to hold out the possibility that Russia has nurtured networks, very extensive networks. Those networks are starting to be uncovered in Europe, in Germany and other places. And I rather suspect those networks are far, far more extensive than anyone expected previously. And we're probably only touching the tip of the iceberg. The US is not immune from this. So whereas there are people who would say, right, the US border first, et cetera, I would say, well, hang on a second. If a foreign power is trying to influence your politics and is using immigration, are using criminal gangs, transporting fentanyl, are trying to weaponize your electoral process. If a foreign power is injecting fuel onto the fire, then this isn't just a Ukraine issue. This is a domestic issue because your institutions, your values are under threat. And I'm not sure you can Russia's influence. It's clear, certainly in Europe, that there has been the intent to weaponize migration and illegal migration or economic migration. There's been a clear attempt to try to destabilize Europe over a number of years. Syria ticks many, many boxes in terms of Russian warfare. I mean, one, you're supporting an ally. That ally is dependent on you for arms. You get their money. You get part of their resources. You retain a foothold in the Middle East. So Syria ticks all the geopolitical boxes, the ones that people say, well, of course, if you're a great power, that's what. It also box that you are able to escalate the conflict and force hundreds and thousands and eventually millions of Syrian refugees onto Europe to destabilize, let's say, European political systems. And when that happens, people feel threatened. They tend to move towards the right. And we know that Russia has made significant investments in extreme or far-right groupings. So if we look at it issue by issue and we try to divorce things into a Britain first or America first, what we're really missing is the multi-layered malign intent of an entity like Russia.
Yes, I remember receiving a leaflet on my doorstep a few months before Brexit. And don't worry, we're not going down that avenue, although I did have an interesting conversation with a fellow YouTuber about Brexit. People, if you'll be on your screens. But I remember that leaflet, and it was an image of Europe. And in the image, they had, do we know how far they're going to come, or where are they going to come from now? This kind of loaded terminology and language. And in the Europe, and that was it, potential future members. And it had part of it was Europe, but then on the sort of bottom right part of it was Turkey, which has been in negotiation since 1987, and Syria. And it was just sort of like the most basic attempt at visual propaganda I've seen in a while. In that it's like, we'll just stick an image of Syria in a map of Europe and say, well, could they join the EU one day? And it's like, is this supposed to manipulate people? But it does. And the Russians are very effective in it. Yeah. So it was, your description there about the Syrian element just brought up that hilarity for me. But I guess the last question I have for you, Jonathan, really is, what are some of the ways that we can better deal with these sorts of individuals or these sorts of strategies? I would like to swear, but I think I'll refrain from doing so because I don't know YouTube's terms and conditions enough yet, community guidelines. But what should we do? How do we deal with this? Do you think it's already beginning to see some shifts just in its own way, or there are active steps myself,
I think,
the audience,
there are definitely steps people can take. And I recall a conversation I had with a very interesting chap who's in Moscow. He's an activist doing extraordinary things. He was working to try and identify Ukrainian children who'd been abducted. I'm not going to mention his name because I think he's in extreme danger. I think anyone who does that sort of thing is in extreme danger. But after Navalny was killed, and I use that term advisedly, one way or another, his death was the direct intent of the Kremlin. There's no question about that. There was a lot of despair, and a lot of people obviously came out and, in a fairly private manner, queued up, laid flowers, and so on. Obviously, all their faces were logged by surveillance systems, and many of them in the subsequent weeks and months would have found call-up papers arriving at their homes or places of work just by having gone and laid flowers at a monument or something like that. So that's the kind of society that is. But people do take extraordinary risks. And I ask him, how do you cope with this? Because I know that a lot of people who oppose the regime in Russia, are at risk not just of physical harm, but of depression. One of the whole mechanics of an authoritarian regime is to try and make you feel like it's you alone, that somehow you are an aberration. If you hold these views, then there may even be something psychologically wrong with you because you're the only one and nobody else thinks like you do. There's a definite effect here. This is one of the reasons why Putin's regime triumphed in Belarus. It was able to convince people that no help was coming and that they couldn't help each other and that actually they were in a minority. And it picked them off and made examples of people. It didn't need to kill and torch hundreds of thousands. It just needed to do that to a handful of individuals, but then make sure all the others got the message, saw the video, heard the audio. You know how that kind of terror works. And I asked him, how do you get through this? He says, look, what you need to understand is taking action is the best remedy to feelings of despair and nihilism. Go out and do something. Just go out and do something. Go out and help somebody. Go out and make one individual's life better. He said, that is absolutely the best remedy for all of this kind of despair. I kind of think that if you extrapolate that out, one of the problems we've got in the West is that people are assuming that problems will be solved by somebody else. We have institutions. Somebody's working on it, right? It doesn't have to be me. Somebody's working on it, but they're not. And many, many times, well, they may be, but things like countering propaganda, things like changing electoral systems, things like creating a resilient society are dependent on individuals finding problems and solving problems and not relying on government to do it. And I think that's the biggest lesson from Ukraine. They know that their democracy is fairly nascent. They know that their government is got pockets of corruption. They know that it's incompetent in areas. They know that actually it's not sophisticated to solve everybody's problems because it doesn't have the resources, the means, or the sophistication to do it. And Ukrainians go out and they say, well, no one's going to solve this unless I solve it. I think we need to learn that process. We need to revive our sense of civic society, and we need to go out and do stuff. I think it's personally very beneficial, but also it's an absolute necessity in the kind of propaganda-infused social media toxic cesspool that our societies now are exposed to, and the almost, I would say, limitless ability of nefarious regimes to use these technologies like AI and social media to corrupt us. If we don't get out and do stuff and participate, I fear that our values and institutions will not survive the next couple of decades.
Wow. And on that note, everybody, I like to leave with a call to action in my videos, in my conversations, and there's very clearly one there. So that's been Jonathan Fink. Thank you so much for joining us on the Global Gambit. It's been a pleasure. My name has been Piotr, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. But as always,